Snow fell in hard, wind-cutting sheets on the northern edge of Monschau on 17th of January 1945, and the women had nothing left to drink except what they could catch in their bare hands. For 24 to 36 hours, according to the Ardennes after-action reports, they had survived by holding out trembling palms and letting snowflakes melt into thin streams that barely reached their tongues. Some were telegraph assistants forced into Volkssturm retreat columns. Some were clerks dragged from collapsing offices. Some were nurses whose units had been overrun. And some were Eastern European conscripts who did not even speak German. They were not soldiers. They were simply in the wrong place as the front tore itself open. Frost clung to their eyebrows. Their lips had split. A few had stopped speaking entirely. The forest around Kalterherberg was so silent that even their breaths felt loud. When American boots finally crunched through the snow, several women recoiled, expecting shouts, rifles, or the blunt end of a punishment they had been told would come the moment they surrendered. Instead, something impossible happened. A GI knelt down beside them with a steaming tin cup of coffee. The vapor curled upward like a small miracle in the white cold. For a moment, nobody moved. One woman, her hair stiff with ice, backed away and whispered the only words her mind could form. "Is this really for us?" Behind the kneeling GI, an entire patrol from the 9th Infantry Regiment emerged through the trees, shaking snow off their shoulders. One soldier warmed a steel canteen under his jacket, knowing sub-zero metal could burn skin, then gently pressed it into the hands of a woman whose fingers shook so hard she couldn't close them properly. Another crouched to shield the coffee from falling snow, placing his palm above the cup so that not a single flake would cool it before she tasted warmth again. The women stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Americans bending down, not to bark orders, but to protect a drink meant for them. A few feet away, one POW looked at the coffee and asked, with genuine terror, whether it was meant for the dead, because she believed such warmth could only belong to American casualties being prepared for evacuation. Another woman tried to lift the cup, but couldn't. Her fingers curled limply. A GI noticed the purple tint on her eyelids, the slow response of her hands, the whitewashed lips. Hypothermia, stage 3. Without hesitation, he stripped off his outer coat, wrapped her inside it, and lifted her toward an ambulance while she struggled to whisper the same impossible question. "Is this really for us?" Snow blew sideways across the frozen clearing as the GIs distributed more cups. One POW, convinced the Americans would take everything back if she appeared greedy, secretly handed a sip of her own coffee to the friend beside her. A soldier saw this and shook his head softly. "No need to share," he said. "There's enough warmth for everyone today." In the bleak midwinter of a collapsing war, the line of women finally held still, staring at cups radiating heat, unable to understand why the enemy was protecting something meant for them. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? The march began before sunrise, when the sky was the color of bruised steel and the wind scraped the treetops of the Eifel like knives. The women were ordered to move from Kalterherberg toward a temporary U.S. outpost near Hofen, their bodies weakened from hunger and days of hiding in snow-thickened woods. Many were not soldiers at all, but civilians swept into the collapsing German retreat. Telegraph operators from Aachen, clerks from Düren, farm girls from the outskirts of Bitburg, and 2 Eastern European laborers who had been forced to serve as orderlies for a retreating Volkssturm detachment. They walked in a single file that stretched and broke apart every few minutes, the snow swallowing their footsteps as quickly as they made them. The American guards kept a respectful distance, uncertain how fragile their prisoners truly were. One GI from K Company later wrote that he had never seen such exhaustion, noting how one woman held onto a broken radio headset as if it were a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. Another POW whispered that she'd worked as an accountant just 2 weeks earlier and had been seized by officers who refused to let her stay behind when their unit retreated. The ideological wall that propaganda had built for years was already cracking. These women did not speak like enemies. They spoke like people pulled into a current they couldn't swim against. As the column moved along the snow-choked road, small details carried painful weight. A shoestring snapped on one woman's boot, but she kept walking with her heel exposed because she feared asking for help. The Eastern European orderly stepped out of line to grab a fallen scarf, and 2 GIs instinctively reached for the rifles before realizing she had only stumbled. A telegraph assistant muttered station codes under her breath like prayers, reciting sequences she had memorized during long nights in freezing communication huts. These were the anecdotes that never reached official reports. Tiny human pieces that survived only in scattered diaries and testimonies. The march paused near a row of shattered pines where the wind funneled through the trees with a low moan. One GI handed out ration biscuits, apologizing as if ashamed of the shortage, and the women stared at him with a confusion more powerful than fear. It was the first time in months anyone had offered them food without shouting. One POW tucked her biscuit into her sleeve, saving it for a friend too weak to walk steadily. Another asked softly whether American soldiers ever argued about rations, the way German units had in the final weeks of the campaign. She was shocked when a GI laughed and said they argued about everything, including who made the worst coffee. Step by step, the march became more than movement. It became comparison. The women, taught to expect brutality, saw instead an enemy whose discipline was firm, but not cruel. The Americans, told to expect hardened fanatics, saw shivering clerks and conscripts whose eyes held the same fear as civilians fleeing bombardment. A before and after contrast took root quietly. The women who once believed in the inevitability of a German victory now walked behind soldiers whose supply lines were strong, whose morale seemed untouched, and whose compassion intruded on every assumption they had carried. When the outpost finally came into view, a cluster of snow-dusted sandbags and tents glowing faintly in the morning light, the women stopped without being told. The wind fell silent for a moment, as if the forest itself acknowledged a threshold being crossed. No one spoke. They only looked at one another, realizing they were stepping into a world built by the very army they had been taught to fear. Behind them, the snow kept falling, covering the footprints almost as soon as they formed, erasing the path that had brought them here, but not the weight of what they had begun to understand. The outpost along the Hofen line was little more than a half-buried supply dugout, a line of canvas tents reinforced with broken timber, and a single potbelly stove fighting a losing battle against the Ardennes cold. Yet, to the women who stepped toward it, it looked like a foreign planet. Heat shimmered faintly from the stovepipe. Wooden crates lay open, revealing tins of coffee, powdered milk, socks, field bandages, and a stack of metal cups whose rims were still warm from recent use. The women stood in a hesitant cluster, uncertain whether they were allowed to approach, unsure whether the comfort they saw was even meant for them. A medic from the 60th Medical Battalion emerged first, brushing snow off his sleeves. He motioned for them to come closer, but the invitation only deepened their confusion. One woman, an overworked telegraph assistant named Ruth Keller, kept her hands folded tight around her chest, convinced the coffee was bait for interrogation. Another POW, a seamstress forced into a Wehrmachtshelferinnen column during the retreat, whispered that Americans didn't waste good coffee on prisoners. A fragment from her confiscated diary later captured her panic. They offer warmth. Why? Warmth is not for the defeated. When the first GI approached with a steaming cup, the women instinctively stepped back. The soldier hesitated, then did something they had never imagined. He crouched lower, holding the cup at their height, as though greeting frightened civilians rather than enemies. Steam rose between them like a fragile bridge. A few women exchanged fearful glances. Others watched the Americans more closely, noticing expressions that did not match the brutality they'd been warned about. One young POW muttered that the GI's gaze looked more confused than threatening, as if he could not understand why they refused something so simple. The moment shifted when the GI, who had warmed a steel canteen earlier, placed it gently into the hands of a woman named Elfrida, whose fingers had gone stiff from frostbite. She flinched. He reassured her quietly, explaining he had checked the temperature against his own skin first. She looked at him, bewildered, searching his face for the cruelty she expected but could not find. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. His answer was disarmingly casual. "You look colder than my kid sister." The comparison struck her deeper than the warmth spreading through the metal. It was the first time in weeks someone had spoken to her without calculation or suspicion. Nearby, another POW stared at the hot coffee with a dread that startled the Americans. She finally asked whether the drink was meant for the dead, because in her unit, the last cups of warm liquid had been kept for the gravely wounded or for bodies awaiting transport. The medic shook his head, pressing the cup toward her until she accepted it with shaking hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks instantly, surprising even her. It was not the heat of the drink that broke her. It was the shattering of a belief she had carried like armor. Around the dugout, everyday interactions unfolded that would never appear in official histories. Two GIs argued over who had brewed the stronger pot. A corporal scolded his buddy for nearly spilling coffee onto the snow. A black ammunition handler from the 333rd Field Artillery, temporarily assigned to the outpost, drew stares from the POWs. Half of them shocked to see a black soldier treated with the same authority as his white comrades, the other half quietly recording this in their mental ledger of contradictions. One woman whispered, "They stand together," as if noting an impossible fact. The scene closed on a symbolic gesture. Snow began falling harder, thick, wet flakes threatening to cool the steaming cups. A GI lifted his hand over a woman's drink so no snowflake would touch the surface, guarding it as though it were precious. She watched him in complete disbelief, unable to reconcile this protective kindness with everything she had been taught. And then, in a whisper that seemed to hover over all of them, one POW said again, "Is this really for us?" The answer, for the first time in months, needed no explanation. Inside the canvas tent, the air felt impossibly warm compared to the blizzard outside. A gasoline stove burned with a steady hiss, filling the space with a faint metallic smell that mixed with wool, wet boots, and the sharp scent of disinfectant from opened medical kits. The women stepped inside cautiously, blinking at the sudden shift in temperature. Their frozen lashes melted into droplets that ran down their cheeks like tears they hadn't chosen to shed. The tent was lit by a single lantern, hanging from a rope tied between two support beams, and its light flickered gently over a cluster of confiscated items on a wooden table: letters, diaries, bundles of string, and tiny cloth pouches that held the last fragments of their vanished lives. A medic invited them to sit, but most remained standing, gripping their coats as though warmth itself might vanish if they let go. A few dared to approach the table where their diaries had been placed for inspection. Among them was a woman named Marta Weiss, once an accountant from Aachen, whose diary had been seized earlier that morning. She opened it with trembling hands and found the last sentence she had written before capture. "We walk, but not toward safety, only toward whatever comes first." She pressed her thumb over the line as though shielding it from foreign eyes. The Americans noticed the tension and tried to soften the atmosphere. One GI poured coffee into cups and placed them carefully near the stove to keep them warm. Another set a tin of condensed milk on the edge of the burner, rotating it slowly so it wouldn't scorch. These understated gestures, quiet, simple, and free of ceremony, made the women exchange bewildered glances. They had spent months under German officers who barked orders, confiscated blankets, and punished hesitation. Now they stood in a place where the enemy warmed milk for them, so the shock of heat wouldn't hurt their stomachs. There were small sounds. A pencil scratching as a medic filled out intake forms, the stove crackling softly, and the occasional flop of snow sliding off the tent roof. But it was the human whispers that carried the most weight. One POW murmured that she had been forced into service because her husband was already at the front. Another admitted she had hidden her mother's address inside her boot, terrified the Americans would destroy it. A third, an Eastern European woman whose German was broken, described how she had been taken from a textile factory and assigned to a retreating unit against her will. Their voices braided into a quiet tapestry of fear, grief, and exhaustion. The stove thawed more than their hands. It thawed confessions. A telegraph assistant named Ruth whispered that she had once believed the German army would protect its women. Another said she had memorized propaganda slogans, but never truly understood them until now, seeing how easily they dissolved under the smallest act of kindness. One woman stared at the lantern light for a long moment before admitting she no longer knew what enemy meant. These weren't philosophical statements. They were the stunned realizations of people who had seen the myth of invincibility collapse around them. Anecdotes surfaced in the warmth of the tent, fragments the women had carried in silence. One recalled a German officer who fled with the last horse, leaving the support staff to walk 40 kilometers through snow. Another described soldiers burning abandoned telegraph cables for heat, filling the forest with the bitter smell of melting insulation. A third spoke of a rumor that American rations contained more calories in a single meal than an entire German outpost received in a day. The Americans listened quietly, neither denying nor confirming, and something in their silence felt gentler than any argument. As the warmth deepened, so did the contrast between the lives they had led and the reality before them. The stove, the lantern, the hot coffee, ordinary objects, now held symbolic power. They represented a truth they were not ready to articulate, that their world had been built on fear, and this one, impossibly, was not. When the lantern flickered and cast long shadows across their faces, the women fell silent together. It wasn't fear this time. It was something closer to recognition, something closer to the beginning of a change they hadn't sought but could no longer ignore. Dawn came slowly over the ridge near Hufen, revealing a landscape reshaped overnight. Snow trenches glazed with ice, tire tracks from night convoys hardened like scars across the valley, and long shadows stretching from American supply trucks that seemed to multiply every hour. For the women POWs, the morning light did more than illuminate the camp. It exposed the scale of a world they had never imagined, one that contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness, chaos, and moral decay. The contrast was immediate, overwhelming, and irreversible. A convoy from the 2nd Infantry Division arrived first, its engines rumbling low as drivers unloaded crates stenciled with numbers the women could hardly believe. Each U.S. soldier carried rations weighing nearly 5 pounds per day. Each truck delivered enough supplies to feed an entire German company. And each morning, more than 400 such vehicles moved through the Schnee-Eifel during the reorganization after the Bulge. A POW named Elfriede, still wrapped in the coat the GI had placed around her, counted 27 trucks before losing track. "How can a country feed this many men?" she whispered. "Our village could not feed 20. Her question lingered in the cold air. Nearby, Marta noticed a logistics officer organizing crates with effortless coordination. The system ran like a river. Fuel drums rolled in one direction, medical kits in another, socks and blankets stacked into neat pyramids by quartermasters who joked while they worked. The women stared at the ease of it, unable to understand how the same army they had been told was soft and collapsing could move mountains before breakfast. A medic, overhearing them, mentioned casually that American factories had produced more than 2 million tons of supplies in the previous month alone. One woman gasped. Another sat down hard in the snow. This was the moment the old ideology began to snap. Not from force, but from sheer contradiction. Then came something even more disorienting: racial integration. A black soldier from the 333rd, carrying blankets across the yard, paused to greet a white lieutenant with easy familiarity. The women froze. One whispered that in her town, black men existed only in posters warning of imagined dangers. Another stared openly, trying to reconcile the propaganda images she had memorized as a girl with the composed, disciplined man before her. When the lieutenant thanked him, the women exchanged looks of disbelief so deep they bordered on grief. A world they had never known was unfolding in front of them, and they realized they had been kept in darkness. Everywhere they looked, the differences widened. American guards who shared their cigarettes casually, medics who checked frostbite without judgment, soldiers who complained about the taste of rations, not the absence of them. A GI pulling his buddy aside to argue about baseball scores. These tiny, everyday acts felt like hammer blows against the rigid fear they had carried for years. Even the way Americans laughed, openly, loudly, without glancing over their shoulders, felt like a revelation. The psychological shift was not sudden. It was a quiet, creeping warmth, much like the coffee that had stunned them hours earlier. The women sensed the change, but didn't dare name it. It terrified them to think they had been lied to. It terrified them even more to admit they had believed it. One POW finally said what many were thinking: if they treat us this way as prisoners, how do they treat their own? The question hung in the cold like a spark waiting for oxygen. And for you watching now, what moment would have broken your beliefs first? Which detail hits you hardest? The supply trucks, the mixed units, or the warmth of the coffee? The trucks that would carry the women toward Liège arrived just after midday, engines idling softly beneath the muffled snowfall. A thin plume of exhaust curled into the air, blending with the steam rising from the women's breath as they stood in a quiet line beside the vehicles. They had expected chains, shouting, maybe even beatings. Instead, the American guards spoke in low, steady voices, organizing the transfer as though handling civilians displaced by a storm rather than prisoners of a collapsing regime. The contrast unsettled them more than hostility would have. A sergeant from the 60th Medical Battalion checked each woman before she climbed aboard. He inspected fingers for frostbite, tested pulse rates, and asked simple questions. Had they eaten? Could they walk without pain? Did they feel dizzy? These were the same checks he performed on American soldiers. One POW, a seamstress named Clara, murmured in disbelief that German officers had never asked such things, only whether she could still work. The sergeant didn't respond. He simply handed her a pair of wool socks and urged her to move closer to the stove inside the truck. Inside the canvas-covered vehicles, gestures continued to build a strange, uneasy warmth. A GI from Iowa, Private Lewis Hart, noticed a woman shivering violently even though she sat closest to the lantern. Without hesitation, he draped his spare blanket around her shoulders, then stepped back as if afraid of embarrassing her. Another POW hesitated to sit, unsure whether she was allowed, until a corporal tapped the wooden bench gently, silently reassuring her. These tiny acts landed like aftershocks, breaking assumptions one by one. The journey itself unfolded through a landscape buried in snow and hushed by distance. The trucks jolted over frozen ruts, past rows of shattered farmhouses, and rumbled across bridges temporarily reinforced with Bailey panels that gleamed faintly under the winter sun. The women stared out through gaps in the canvas, catching brief glimpses of American engineers waving the convoy through. One POW whispered that Germany had once boasted about its engineering superiority, yet here she saw Allied bridges built in hours, standing firm where German structures had collapsed. Another woman recalled the propaganda phrase, "resource-starved America," then looked at the endless line of supply vehicles stretching behind them and felt something inside her fracture. Anecdotes surfaced during the ride, as they often do in confined spaces. A GI joked about the taste of army coffee, calling it engine oil with courage mixed in. Two soldiers argued whether their rations had arrived late because someone misread a map. One POW stared at them with a mixture of awe and confusion, unable to imagine German enlisted men openly teasing each other in front of superiors. Another woman noticed how one of the Americans carefully positioned his rifle away from the group, pointing it toward the floor rather than toward the prisoners. She didn't know why this mattered so deeply, but it did. At a brief stop near Eupen, the humans inside the truck faced one another not as captors and captives, but as people caught in the same storm. A medic offered cigarettes, lighting them for the women whose hands still trembled. A POW reached out hesitantly and touched the sleeve of an American's coat, stunned by the warmth of the fabric. She confessed she had been warned Americans would strip prisoners of everything they owned. The GI shook his head and said quietly that no one here would take anything from her. She turned away, overwhelmed. The before and after contrast sharpened as the convoy neared Liège. Hours earlier, these women had been freezing, starving, and terrified of what capture might bring. Now they rode in trucks warmed by lanterns, drinking coffee they were still afraid to finish, wrapped in blankets they hadn't dared to request. They were still prisoners, but prisoners treated with a dignity they hadn't received from their own army in months. As soldiers prepared to unload them at the processing area, a question rose quietly among the women, not spoken but shared in their glances. If this was how the enemy cared for them, what did it say about the war they had lived inside? And for you watching this, if you had been in that truck, what single gesture would have changed you the most? The blanket, the coffee, the quiet respect? When the convoy entered the outskirts of Liège, the war felt strangely distant. Snow still fell in thick waves, but the air carried a warmth the women had not felt in months. A warmth made of voices, engines, and the steady movements of an army that operated with an orderliness almost unreal to them. The processing center stood inside a former Belgian factory whose broken windows had been patched with canvas sheets, each one flapping softly in the winter wind. American MPs guided the trucks into place, waving flashlights that carved thin beams through the swirling snow. The women climbed down slowly, blinking at the rows of lamps illuminating the yard. A small field kitchen had been set up near the entrance, and the scent of something warm drifted across the cold air. A GI stirred a pot with a long wooden ladle. occasionally wiping condensation from his glasses. The ordinary humanity of the scene left the women momentarily paralyzed. For weeks, they had been treated as expendable bodies in a collapsing retreat. Here, in a camp run by the enemy, someone was preparing food. Inside the reception building, clerks seated behind wooden tables processed names, origins, and units. Each woman received a medical check, a blanket, and space to sit. Not comfort, but not cruelty either. The contrast simmered beneath their confusion. A POW named Ruth whispered that the Germans had evacuated their own wounded from Aachen by leaving them to walk behind carts. Another woman, Marta, stared at the steam rising from a newly filled cup of coffee and said she hadn't smelled something warm since autumn. The Americans overheard but made no comment. They didn't need to. Reality spoke for them. An unexpected moment unfolded near the rear of the hall. A woman named Elfrida, still recovering from stage 3 hypothermia, looked at the hot coffee in her hands and hesitated. Her mind, shaped by weeks of brutality and fear, clung to a paranoid certainty. If she drank it all, the Americans might take it back or punish her friend. So she gently tipped her cup toward the woman beside her, sharing one sip. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but a GI standing nearby noticed. He crouched down eye level with both and said in a soft, steady tone, "No need to share. There's enough warmth for everyone today." His words fell like a slow thaw across the room. Diaries later recovered from the camp captured moments that would have faded otherwise. A telegraph assistant wrote that she had seen American soldiers argue about baseball, then help each other bandage frostbite without waiting for orders. Another confessed she had spent years believing Americans were greedy, only to watch a GI give his entire lunch to a POW who looked too weak to stand. One woman noted that a black GI had stood beside white officers without fear, a sight she described as impossible and yet true. These entries, small and personal, formed the undercurrent of a psychological shift more profound than the women understood in that moment. Outside, the snow had slowed to a fine, drifting dust. A GI carried a crate of enamel cups across the yard, pausing to let two POWs pass rather than making them step aside. Another soldier scraped ice from the steps so the women wouldn't slip. These human gestures, multiplied across minutes and hours, accumulated into something transformative. Not friendship, not trust. Something quieter, more fragile. The first glimmer of rehumanization. The symbolic moment came at dusk. A lantern was hung beside the entrance, its light forming a warm halo on the falling snow. The women lined up for their evening ration, and as each received a small cup of coffee, they cupped their hands around it, as though holding a piece of the world they had lost. None dared drink too quickly. None forgot the forest where snow had been their only water. None forgot the hands that had shielded their first cup from falling flakes. The image lingered long after night settled. Women who have been taught to fear the enemy, standing beneath a lantern's glow, holding coffee given freely, steam rising into the dark, snow settling gently on their shoulders, and a question whispering through their minds, impossible yet real. If compassion could exist here, in war, what else had been hidden from them? The memory of that winter would follow the women for decades, long after their release, long after peace reshaped Europe's borders, long after the uniforms and weapons and ruined towns faded into the archives of history. What endured was not a single event, but a sequence of quiet, human gestures that softened something frozen deep inside them. They would carry the sensation of warm metal against frostbitten fingers, the shock of being offered a cup without conditions, the hum of American supply trucks that contradicted the rhetoric they had memorized since childhood. They would remember how fear and indoctrination had kept them from seeing the world clearly, how exhaustion made even kindness feel dangerous at first, and how dignity, simple, ordinary dignity, was something they had nearly forgotten was possible. In later years, some wrote letters describing that journey from snowfields to shelter, comparing it to stepping from a collapsing tunnel into a room lit by a single lamp. Others shared stories with their children about the contrast between the world they thought existed and the one they found in a battered Belgian factory on a winter afternoon. For a few, the smell of coffee would forever carry a complicated mix of gratitude, sorrow, and disbelief. Not because the drink itself mattered, but because of what it symbolized, the possibility that even in war, warmth could travel farther than hatred. History often fixes its gaze on battles, commanders, and shifting lines on maps. Yet the truth that lingers is shaped just as powerfully by moments like these. When a hand shields a cup from falling snow, when a blanket is offered without hesitation, when prisoners expected cruelty but found something else, something unsettling, something profoundly human. And in those moments, something within them thawed.